All right, good morning, guys. Hopefully your day's going well. We're going to get started today. And like I mentioned just a bit ago, if you had not logged in at that time, we're going to be working with period 6 today to take a look at that content to get you guys ready for the AP test. So please make sure that you've got that handy, the notes that you've got from the period of the Gilded Age forward and going all the way up until the Spanish-American War. And we'll be taking a look at that content to make sure that you're good. Let me bring this then to our presentation. So let me show you a few different things today as we get started. Number one, like I mentioned to you previously, you should be checking out the AP online course schedule. And in particular, you should be taking a look at these videos as you guys are working your way through the preparation process. Their video series currently is running live with reviews, kind of like what we're doing as well. And like I mentioned to you earlier this week, it is not a bad idea to check out these videos to see what they're saying in combination of what you're getting from me. And bigger picture, what you should be taking a look at is how they're addressing skills development. Now, what we looked at yesterday is I had you taking a look at the video that they did previously covering content that we were reading from your textbook, getting into America and the world as a world power and the Vietnam War. And one of the things they were highlighting is the ability to be able to handle political cartoons and nonverbal documents. And those are things that are going to show up on the AP test. They've promised that one of the 5 documents in a DBQ will be visual sources that are not text-based, map, graph, chart, political cartoon, something like that. So that's what these videos are nice for. And I wanted yesterday to be an introduction for that so that as you guys are working your way through your process, you're able to do well. You guys remember that you've got reading that you're doing from your textbook, and you'll notice that they've got videos now that they've covered that aligns with each of the parts of your textbook that you're reading. So when you read your textbook, you should go back to here to take a look at the video that corresponds with the chapter reading that you're doing. You should also be taking a look at the crash course videos that are here to help you out as well. And my assumption is that from this point forward, you guys will be good with building this stuff up as your contextualization. But over the next few weeks, we're going to spend more of our time focusing on reviewing for the AP test, building up writing skills and whatever, especially since now that we've covered the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, we'll be able to double back and look at content from your new stuff, especially once we get some guidance from the state of Minnesota as far as what we're doing with our rest of the school year. Governor Walz has said that sometime this week he does want to address the question of schools, but he hasn't done so yet. We are one of the few states in the country, 37 states so far, have given guidance either to end in-person education for the rest of the school year or to continue distance learning. We have not done that yet, and we are doing really well as far as like infection rates and whatever, but we've been seeing those infection rates increasing over the past couple of weeks as they were predicting. So I'm waiting for the governor to give a heads up and an official declaration as far as what we're doing. If it turns out that we are sheltering in place and not coming back to school, then we'll start doing more of the testing on current content that you've been reading from. But I've been hesitating and holding back in case we do get some sort of announcement that we're coming back in May so that we'll be able to do the in-person testing there. Instead of doing that, we've been doing assessment via DBQ. We've done 2 formatives. This Friday is your first summative. And so what will be happening on Friday is you'll be doing a DBQ test. The DBQ test is going to be run in the format of what's been done by what's been prescribed by the College Board. So we'll all be starting at 8 a.m. You'll be typing an essay and you'll get 45 minutes to type your essay, 5 minutes to submit, and that includes the reading time of the DBQ. And so it's going to be rather quick. For the scoring of these DBQs, this is what your scoring model is going to look like. And so this is your breakdowns 8, 6, 4, 2 as far as the scoring on your rubric out of the 10-point scale. And so if you found that the last DBQs were problematic, then we want to work on getting those fixed up. And we'll be taking time tomorrow just to talk about DBQ writing to give you help figure out what you're doing with the DBQ process. And in particular, I've already graded out 2 of the 3 sections of essays, minus Emma's. And so Emma, if you are thinking that you haven't gotten yours back, it's because I fell asleep while I was grading yours last night. So I'll need to redo that grading just to make sure that the scoring is looking right. And then you should be getting yours back soon. And then period 4 kids, you'll be getting yours back throughout the course of the day today. Tomorrow, then we'll discuss what's going on with the grading process. What problems are you having? But if you look at the scale and you're thinking, oh my goodness, I'm in deep trouble, we need to work on fixing that up then as quickly as possible, since we're 3.5 weeks away from the AP test. So keep that in mind as you guys are working your way through. Your DBQ can be from any time period, period 3 through 6. So we'll be covering for that essay test tomorrow, on Friday, material that we've already reviewed through these review sessions themselves. Today, then, what we're going to be taking a look at is period 6 in your concept outline. And so if you could please flip there, that would be fantastic. Period 6, 1865 to 1898. This is the end of the Civil War to the start of the Spanish-American War. And what you see is that there's an overlap that takes place in these time periods. Period 5 ran you through 1877 with Reconstruction. It's what your DBQ was about. When you were writing about how much we should view the changes during the Civil War as being revolutionary in nature. So with period 6, what we're looking at then is we're taking a look at the developments that are happening on top of the Reconstruction era. These are happening simultaneously. And so as we get context for what is taking place during this time period, it says here, explain the historical context for the rise of industrial capitalism in the United States. This is a DBQ that we played around with in class, the idea of how, what was it that caused the rise of the Gilded Age? And we highlighted when we were studying this in class that there were technological advances and the development of large scale production methods and the opening of brand new markets that caused an industrial boom in the late 1800s, which would become known as the Gilded Age. The large-scale production that you learn about with new technologies and internal communication networks and pro-growth government policies created massive economic growth. And some of this stuff started during the Civil War. You remember during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln inflated our money supply by creating greenbacks. He put into place tariffs that protected our businesses from foreign competition. He gave contracts to businesses in the United States to help him out with the Civil War effort, much like Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt did with World War I and World War II. And so as a result of all of that, you're going to have then the seeds planted for the Gilded Age. He redid the transportation networks, building all the railroads to a standard gauge so that they could travel along the same width of train track to help ease trade across the country. And this is the beginning of laissez-faire economics, where we're putting into place a lot of pro-business decisions that will protect the businesses against things that might inhibit their ability to grow. As we take a look during this time period, though, remember we have economic downturns. And what I taught you about throughout the course of this time in December and January was the rule of threes. You have two big panics in 1873 and 1893, and a smaller one in 1883. And what we learned about is that during a panic, rich and poor people respond to panics differently. Poor people get hurt significantly. And remember the phrase, prices are fluid, but wages are sticky. But we're going to find that for business owners, this is the time to make their monopolies bigger when the economy takes a downturn, because as people stop spending money, you can then find prices that are cheaper and make your monopoly bigger. We will also find that inside farms, you will have new technologies that are happening there. McCormick Reaper, most notably, using the railroads to get stuff back and forth from markets. And we're going to find that for the farmers during this time period, they're able to produce more food, driving down prices, which will then cause them to become more and more interested in aggressive government policies to deal with that. All of these things provide the context where the Gilded Age is coming from. Let me see here. Ella, can I check my email or Schoology messages from me? I've been able to find a Google Doc with my score comments from period 3 DBQ. Yep, I can take a look at that as soon as we get done today. All right. We also want to understand the contextualization in the late 1800s of immigration that's taking place from outside the country and migrations that are happening from farm country into the city to help build up the workforces that we have. And so we want to be able to talk about what movement looks like, both internal migration and external migration, and also the movement out west is something you'll want to be able to describe. During the Gilded Age, then we also want to understand what is happening with the society in reaction to what's happening in the changes in our society. So what you want to be noticing is the change from sectionalism, north versus south. And instead, you will find that there are some people who are going to be getting into an argument over things that either say the Gilded Age is okay. So think about the idea of laissez-faire economics, social Darwinism, the gospel of wealth. But there's also people who will be challenging this, people like the populists who are emerging, or the social gospel, who are arguing that there are changes that need to be made and reforms that need to take place. We will also find that there's debates over citizenship. You see a backlash against immigrants during this time period, most notably with the Chinese Exclusion Act. We have tons of corruption with the Gilded Age, especially during the Grant presidency with the Credit Mobilier and the gold scheme. And the question of how should the business and government environment be working, where most of the people in politics believe in laissez-faire economics, but there are some who believe that we need to move in a more progressive reform direction. So here are the things that you should be noticing then. And what I want to highlight for you for period 6, this is again where your essay questions will come from. Explain the causes and the effects of settlement of the West from 1877 to 1898. And when we think about the causes of movement out west, you learned about the ideas of manifest destiny to conquer the Western frontier. You guys have learned about the demand for raw materials and the desire for railroads to expand out west. And so notice the facts that they give you. Farmers have new technologies that will allow them to be able to build up the production of food, but it's going to cause food prices to drop, which is going to cause many of the farmers to feel struggles during this time period. They're going to find that for the farmers themselves, their dependence on these markets that are very much being influenced on the national and international level by all these people trading, and also the dependence on the railroad, which keeps jacking up their rates, they're going to start creating local and regional cooperative organizations. Let me remind you of the ones that you should have over here on the side. They're going to start creating the Grange and the alliances that will eventually lead to the populists during this time period. Following the Civil War, the government is going to be involved in very much helping out businesses with transportation and communication systems, and most notably, that is providing subsidies of land and money to the railroads to build out west. And with the building of the transcontinental railroads and the discovery of mineral resources and government policies that were encouraging economic growth, you had this situation then where the West is very much being spurred by the government to be developed as quickly as possible. You'll have the same objective over here as we had on the previous page, but now you have people who are moving out west, both as internal and external migrants, and they want you to understand what they're moving out west for. Railroads, mining, ranching, farming. Here in Minnesota, there's a lumber element that's going on in northern Minnesota as well. But you've got all of these different needs, and it's the two-way trade that you'll want to be able to discuss. We're having raw materials sent from the West into the factories, and then we've got all these brand new markets out West that can then be used to buy stuff from the factories as the factories are developing these things out. You're going to find then that during this time period, we've got a competition going on between white settlers, American Indians, and Mexican Americans that is going to lead us into conflict. And as we take a look at those conflicts, for Mexican Americans in the Southwest, they faced increasing segregation and discrimination as people started moving into the Southwestern territories and white people started to outnumber Mexican Americans. For Native Americans, let me remind you of the incidents that we talked about that could be applicable during this time period. The ones prior to 1877 would be things like the Dakota conflict here in the state of Minnesota. You also had the actions along the Bozeman Trail with Red Cloud's War. In 1876, you have the Battle of Little Bighorn, which is what's going to cause the movement of troops from the South to the West, and massive Native American wars, like you'll see with the Nez Perce. You'll have Native Americans who are then hunted by the United States government if they break the reservation policies. And oftentimes the reservation policies had treaties that were not being honored, as you can see right down here. And that eventually led to the final massacre during this time period, the massacre at Wounded Knee. These Native Americans are going to try to prevent the destruction of their culture as well, but you've learned about things like the Dawes Severalty Act that you'll want to be able to write about. And then also you learn about the Carlisle School and other Indian schools that are built during this time period to try to figure out ways to assimilate Native Americans. And the phrase that they used for the Carlisle schools was that they needed to kill the Indian but save the man, to try to figure out how to convert the Native Americans into Americans who had the same cultural values and views of white people in the United States. Your next section, we need to be able to explain the various factors that contributed to a CCOT for the New South. This is the piggyback that you guys have to the DBQ that you guys just wrote this past week. We are going to find that there are elements of the Southern system that is going to become more modernized, more industrialized with what's called the New South. This was advocated by Hinton R. Helper with his book, The Impending Crisis of the South, where he argued Southerners were falling behind Northerners because they refused to build factories. Much of the South still depended on agriculture, cotton production, and they replaced slavery with sharecropping. With sharecropping, what you should understand is there are both white and black people who are being bound up inside this system where they're working as tenants, not owning the land that they're working on, paying their rent to plantation owners, and oftentimes find themselves stuck in systematic poverty. And you're going to find that as part of the barriers that's going to lead to the issues with the civil rights movement. The claim that white people in the South are discriminatory towards African Americans because they want to preserve their status. When you see that in this situation, it's not preserving a status that's great. For many of the white tenant farmers in the South, both in the 1800s and moving in the 1900s, you end up with a lot of poor white Americans who are in the South who are frustrated themselves. And when they hear African Americans asking for more rights, many of these white Americans are already feeling like they're pretty low on the whole system. But this is something that at least gives them some distinction between themselves and the African Americans who are facing discrimination. So we're going to find that there is a class of fairly wealthy people who are dominating the Southern system, and a lot of people who found themselves bound up in this system that creates a rigid class structure. We are also going to find that in the late 1800s, we have the court case Plessy versus Ferguson that is going to cement in the idea of separate but equal. And we're going to have all these weird things like eugenics and social Darwinism, whatever, that's going to create the idea that black and white people are not equal with one another. The name that you should have over here on the side is Booker T. Washington. Remember, he is the guy who is going to argue then in this environment that he believes that African Americans and white people can start to break down segregation issues by figuring out ways to desegregate factory work. And he argues in favor of segregation for the time being, largely because he recognizes that in the South, the racism is so entrenched. You've got violence that is breaking out, lynchings that are happening. And he believes that a gradual step forward of just getting African Americans off of sharecropping and into the factories would be a positive gain. The person who's arguing against that in the period just after this moment is W.E.B. Du Bois, and he's arguing that no, we should have immediate equality for all African Americans. He believed in the talented 10th philosophy, taking African Americans and training them to become leaders. And the two of them diverge on what they believe should be happening with equality in response to what's going on with the New South. They do want to be able to explain the effects of what's going on with new technologies in the late 1800s. So let me remind you of a number of them. When it comes to factories, you've got Andrew Carnegie, who is going to be investing heavily in the Bessemer process that mass produces steel. You have Thomas Edison, who is involved in creating all sorts of new innovations, whether it's phonographs or other sorts of technologies. But he is most known for figuring out ways to perfect the filament for a light bulb. You're going to have Alexander Graham Bell, who is going to become famous for the invention of the telephone. You have barbed wire in farm territory. You got all sorts of inventions that are being created, innovations in electricity. They want to be able to speak to these. And if you ever get an essay question like this, they're going to be asking you to actually explain proper noun. What is the innovation that you're describing? And specifically, what was the effect that it had on society? Not just that it was invented, not that you just know the fact, but instead, what was the actual impact that took place? When it comes to the rise of industrial capitalism, this is the rise of the Gilded Age monopolies that you guys saw in the late 1800s that we played around with our Steel Empire game. They're asking you about the socioeconomic, the social and economic continuities and changes that were associated with the rise of monopolies from 1865 to 1898. One of the things that we'll be seeing then is we're going to be seeing that we're going to have this rise of factories that take place, and it's going to lead to this economic development and business consolidation. Consolidation of business means monopolies, the grouping of multiple businesses under just a few different owners, and you saw that with monopolies and trusts and interlocking directorates. And what's going to be happening here is that you're going to have massive factories that are built, and it's going to squeeze out small businesses, because in order to compete with a Carnegie or a Rockefeller, you're going to need to have enough money to be able to build up a factory, keep up with the pace of change, be able to trade over large networks, and you need to be able to have some sort of sway with the government to make sure that they're not passing laws that will break up your monopoly. That's what only a few people are capable of doing: Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, and so on. Businesses are also going to figure out new ways of creating management structures. So this is monopolies and trusts, interlocking directorates, and so on. They're also going to figure out how to trade over distance. And they are also going to be working with a large labor force that they need to figure out ways to make sure that they'll be able to remain a stable workforce. And so that's why they're pushing back against unions, trying to create their trusts and holding companies. And in particular, this is going to lead us into imperialism, because for many of these businesses, they're going to demand high tariffs from the government, but also they're going to be looking to try to trade with other countries while keeping our tariffs. And that encourages then our country to get involved in the Spanish-American War or to take over Hawaii in order to be able to get natural resources from places and to be able to trade with them. When we look at labor during this time period, we are still sticking with the same objective over here, the continuities and changes over time associated with growth of industrial capitalism. We're going to find that before and after the Civil War, working in a factory was incredibly nasty and dangerous sort of work. We're going to find, though, that during this time period, it's kind of tricky to analyze how we should look at factory workers and people working in business, because we're going to see that even though people are not getting pay raises, the cost of everything that is associated with living in the late 1800s, even with new technologies, is becoming cheaper. And in fact, that's one of the arguments that's used nowadays against raising the minimum wage, is the argument that, sure, we haven't been seeing pay increases taking place, but for you guys, the purchase of new technologies that cost double or triple what they did a few years ago, now they're much cheaper because they become our normal. So even if you're not getting pay raises, there are some in our society who argue you don't need a pay raise because prices keep dropping on many different items that we like. That's what we see happening in the late 1800s, except for factory workers at the lowest rungs of society. They're finding that they're not economically keeping up. So it's going to lead to the rise of labor movements. You will need to be able to use specific labor group names. So let me give you a few of them that you'll want to be able to use in your writing. One is the Knights of Labor. They're the first union that is established nationwide in the United States. In the late 1800s, they are taking in both skilled and unskilled workers into their union. They will be undone, though, by the Haymarket Riot, when an anarchist throws a bomb into a group of police officers that will be used to destroy the Knights of Labor as being too radical. The next union that you'll need to know about is the American Federation of Labor. And that's going to be the more stable of the unions. It's still around nowadays. And instead of protesting for all sorts of ideas, They only take in skilled workers. They are protesting only for like better pay, better working conditions, better hours. But they do not want to go in more radical directions with their views of change in society. We will also find in the early 1900s the industrial workers of the world, also known as the Wobblies, and this group will be much more radical during the Progressive Era, but they're going to get destroyed by the Espionage and Sedition Acts during World War I. The Red Scare will undermine them, and they will eventually be wiped out before we get to the 1920s. We will find also that the factory structure is going to start hiring men, women, and children. And so we're going to find that there's a child labor boom that happens, especially since kids have small hands and they can fit inside of machines easily. As we look at immigration and migration, notice the question here, explain how cultural and economic factors affected migration patterns over time. As factory work expanded, we are going to start drawing in more workers from outside the country. And they're going to be coming from parts of the world that we have not attracted immigrants from previously, especially when we're thinking about coming to the West Coast. We have immigrants from Asia, especially coming to build the Transcontinental Railroad. But these are also immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe instead of the previous immigrants that came from Northern and Western Europe. This is going to create a backlash where we're going to have a lot of people who become anti-immigrant during this time period because of the fear of having new waves of immigrants from different places coming to the United States who are bringing different cultures and different viewpoints. Many of these immigrants then will need to settle in neighborhoods that are surrounded by people who are like them culturally and ethnically. And this creates tensions, especially between the people living in farm country and people living in the cities, where the pace of change in the city is quite great, especially with the migrants who are coming in. So as a result, you have your next topic, responses to immigration in the Gilded Age. They're going to be expecting you to understand on the AP test that there is a push for assimilation and Americanization in the late 1800s. For immigrants, then they're being sent to public schools where they're hearing the message quite often that their religion or their ethnicity or their background is not up to snuff and it needs to change. And there's also people in our society who are arguing that efforts to improve immigrants is not even worthwhile because of social Darwinism. If they're destined to become rich, they'll become rich on their own. If they want to work their way up, they can certainly do that. This is where Carnegie's gospel of wealth will come in. He'll be happy to build a library or an opera house or something like that. And if people take advantage, great. If they do not, then that's their fault. Others, though, will believe in what's known as the social gospel, and people like Jane Addams are going to create settlement houses to work with immigrants, to try to help gateway them into the United States, to understand language, customs, and especially they're recognizing that many of these immigrants are working the lowest level jobs, and they are forced to live in slums that are built up with tenement houses. And so they are very much facing conditions that are primed to keep them in poverty. And many people start writing about that during the late 1800s. Muckrakers start coming on the scene. That's where you guys learned about the jungle with Upton Sinclair. But we do see the rise of a middle class during this time period. And that's the group that is becoming more predominant, especially inside the cities. You have people who are moving into jobs that are known as white collar jobs. White collar jobs are different than blue collar jobs. If you ever go to a mechanic, you'll find them oftentimes wearing like a blue denim shirt because if they get oil on it, it's not that big of a deal. It's heavier material, so it won't tear that easily. If you work inside of a business office, though, you'll wear like a white dress shirt that's really terrible for picking up stains. But the assumption is that you're working at a desk anyways, and stains shouldn't be that much of a problem. Many of the people moving into these jobs then are finding that they've got time at night to be able to engage in recreational activities. This is where the rise of like spectator sports comes from, and theaters and other sorts of things in the city that look very much like we have nowadays. We also have the gospel of wealth right here, where you do have leaders who are arguing that it is the obligation of the rich and the powerful to figure out how to pay forward from their wealth what they can do to try to improve society. And Carnegie and Rockefeller and others get involved in philanthropy to try to help out society, but in order to kind of steer the money in ways where they think that they'll have the biggest cultural impact. And oftentimes it's with the idea of building ladders for poor people to work their way into prosperity. We are to the point then where we're going to be seeing reform movements coming during the late 1800s. And so you'll want to study these as you're getting prepared, because it says here, explain how different reform movements responded to the rise of industrial capitalism in the Gilded Age. All I would make note of with this is very much what could be the contextualization for a progressives essay, because when you think about the progressives that rose in the early 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, you're going to find that there are a number of people in the late 1800s who are arguing that there are different ways that our society could be viewed. Some of them are just straight reformers. Some of them are bringing more radical ideas like anarchism, socialism, and communism to the United States. But there's also women who are pushing during this time period for reform like these, but also they're arguing for suffrage and also economic opportunities that are being denied them. And for many of the women, they're very much frustrated by the fact that they've been now hired inside factories in the late 1800s. And during those panics of 1873 and 1893, many factory owners like to lay off the men during that time period and keep the women employed because they paid the women less, but they understood completely that the women were performing the same tasks in the factories as men, so they could get the same amount of work for cheaper. And that would then be damaging to the families at home because their family income would be dinged since they'd be relying on the woman's income rather than the men's income. As we take a look at the role of government in the Gilded Age then, and I ask you to explain continuities and changes in the role of the government in the economy, we discussed a lot the idea of laissez-faire economics in the late 1800s. The panics that you have in 1873 and 1893 are going to put a lot of pressure on the United States government to change their laissez-faire policies. The idea that when the economy crashes, the government does nothing and allows things to kind of work themselves out. People are starting to recognize that the ones who are advocating for this are the ones who also don't hurt during an economic crash. So during the Panic of 1893, you've got monopolies getting bigger, the wealthy get wealthier, prices are going to dip during that time period, but then they'll recover afterwards, but prices are fluid, wages are sticky. Many of the business types are also imperialists. So when it comes to imperialism, you've got business owners who are encouraging the United States to becoming more imperialistic and conquering other territories so we can keep these really high tariffs on foreign trade. And then also have places that are now inside of our tariff wall that we can trade with, like the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Hawaiian Islands, China with the open door policy, and so on. So we look at politics in the Gilded Age then. We want to be able to take a look at the similarities and differences of the political parties during this time period. And we will find that farmers are going to start splitting away from their traditional spot inside the Democratic and Republican parties. Southern farmers had typically been Democrats, Northern farmers had typically been Republicans, but many of the farmers north and south start uniting behind the idea that they're watching their prices deflate. They're not getting enough money for their farm goods. They feel like they're being gouged by the railroad monopoly and the mechanical reaper monopoly, and they're very much asking the government to get involved in breaking up monopolies, regulating rates that the railroads can be charging, doing things to help out with the farmers. But what we'll find is that after the Civil War is done, we do have Republicans and Democrats, but mostly the Republicans and Democrats are pretty similar on what they think the government should be doing. They get involved in the spoil system. They do have slight debates over tariffs. There are battles that go on over greenbacks and the silver policy, like the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. And there are reformers who are pushing back against corruption. So during the Grant presidency, you've got people who are making political cartoons about the credit mobilier and the gold scheme. You've got the cartoons that are being made about Boss Tweed to show the corruption that he's involved in. We will also see the rise of political machines, which will allow immigrants a gateway into the government since they have voting blocks that are largely living in neighborhoods with one another. But what you want to notice is those moments where reformers are going to start making gains. Like after the assassination of James Garfield, we have the creation of the Pendleton Act, and it tears the Republican Party apart into mugwump stalwarts and half-breeds. So we learned that in the late 1800s, we only had one Democrat who was president. That was Grover Cleveland. And the reason why that happened is Republicans divided. Some of them did not want to reform the political system. Others were definitely interested in trying to bring reforms to the economic system. When we take a look at this time period, then it says explain the extent to which industrialization brought change during this time period. We're now back to the beginning. We're going to find that as a result of the Civil War, we have factories then that are built up in ways so that they can then mass produce weapons of war. But then when the war is done, they can now mass produce steel. Rockefeller will start producing oil. We've got railroads that have now been built up. So we've now got this massive factory network that is built up. And after the Civil War is done, they're going to effectively get the government to leave them alone. During that time period, then, we will find that there are economic downturns that take place. But for business owners, they very much believe in the ideas of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. And as a result, when the economy takes downturns, the wealthiest people who control the largest interests will see those as opportunities not to get crushed, but instead to build up their monopolies bigger. As they build up transportation networks, as we have farmers out west who are able to produce enough food so that factory workers can work inside the city without having to worry about supplying for their basic needs, you've now got a labor force that business owners can use. And they're also getting raw materials from the Western frontier that will allow their factories to keep humming. You have migrations that are happening, people moving out west to produce those natural resources, people moving into the country from outside the country, and kids moving off the farms because now you don't need as many kids on the farm since you are now mechanizing with these new technologies. And this is leading us then into the era that is known as the Gilded Age. We will find that there are some people who during the Gilded Age, especially the ones who are most successful during the Gilded Age, they're going to buttress the ideas of the Gilded Age. They're going to say, hey, look, this is working great for me. Everything is fine. No reforms are needed. These are typically middle to upper income white individuals who are doing fantastic in the system that's been created. There are others, though, who are arguing that there are problems in this system, and their voices become louder and louder as we get past the Panic of 1893. You've got the farmers who are protesting. You've got labor unions that are protesting. You've got individuals who are frustrated by the fact that there's corruption and graft and businesses that seem to be dominant. And there's leaders that are starting to work their way up from low levels to higher with different visions as far as what our country could be. If you remember then our transition in the next time period, this is where you have like a hurricane in Galveston, Texas, where instead of doing the same old in 1900, they try out using like city managers to rebuild their city. And they discover that government can work without corruption like they've had during the Gilded Age. It's going to create a new plan. You have the Wisconsin Plan created by Robert La Follette, where he starts regulating monopolies and trying to help out farmers by breaking down the monopolies themselves inside the state. And many people prefer that to having unfettered economics where the businesses are favored. And as a result, some corruption is taking place. Many people in the early 1900s then want to preserve their ability to have businesses that are big and can produce massive amounts. They're just tired of the corruption. And that's where you then have Teddy Roosevelt, our accidental president, who is going to announce a square deal in 1901, where he's going to argue that there are good trusts and there are bad trusts. And he argues that his job is not to destroy all monopolies and take us towards communism or socialism or anarchism. He's instead going to take us into a period of progressivism. So as we take a look at the next unit then that we'll be studying next week, period 7 then gets into that period of progressive change, where we're going to find that after a period of conservative hands-off business, we are going to see a period of more regulation. We'll then have the period of the 1920s where we swing back in the direction of the Gilded Age with Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. And then the period 7 wraps up with Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal after the Great Depression in 1929. This whipsaw back and forth, though, it's great for us to analyze at this point, getting ready for the AP test, because that's oftentimes where your essay questions will come from. They sometimes will want to ask you questions like a compare contrast. Let me close this out. They'll often have to ask you questions about like compare contrast, and so getting into the question of like how were the progressives different than the Gilded Age, or how was the 1920s similar to the Gilded Age, is easily one of the essay questions they could be asking you. Madeline, the question is, let me see here. If we don't go back to school, would one of our DBQs be thrown out instead? That's a really good question. And that's something that I haven't even thought about. And so that's a really good question for me to broach for tomorrow. Audrey, can you tell us what period our Friday DBQ is on? No, we're going to be doing this exactly like we do the AP test in 3 weeks. The only thing that I'll tell you is now that we've covered periods 3 through 6, those are fair game. We have not reviewed period 7 yet. That is not going to be your DBQ. But anything else that we've covered to this point definitely is fair game for your essay test on Friday, because I'm assuming that you've been reviewing like I've been asking you to for the past month. And so I'm hoping that that's the case. Tomorrow, then, what will be happening is I'm going to have your essays graded by the end of today. So I'll be able to get them back to you. Ella, as far as your period 3 DBQ, I'll investigate what's going on with that. I've got them all saved, and so I must just not have hit the share function with you, but hopefully you got a chance to look at your period 5 DBQ that I got graded out, because I do remember grading yours yesterday. And so that's going to be where I'm giving you feedback. Is the first one was just meant to give you kind of a test drive of what's going on with the AP test. And then for you guys, the one that we took this past week was for me to actually start pinning down where are your strengths. Sophia, do you have an example DBQ for us to look at? I'm not certain what you mean by that. If you're asking about actual DBQs that you could like practice and play around with, if you go into AP Classroom, like I showed you this past week, you guys can go in to progress. Sorry, if you go into your question bank, there are optional student practice tests for DBQs that are all open for you. And so I'm sorry, I forgot to click over to this view right here. So if you're asking about looking at actual DBQs, this is where you'll be able to find the DBQs themselves to be able to practice around with them. Now, if your question is an example DBQ, I will be sharing one of those with you tomorrow, so you'll be able to look it over and see what is going on with good writing. I want to get that in your hands before you write on Friday, but I also want to get these essays graded out so I'd be able to look them over. So if you're looking for what an exemplar should look like, you'll be tomorrow, so you'll be able to read that over. Do you guys have any other questions before I turn you loose for today? Okay. Good luck with your preparation. Make sure you're reviewing. Like you guys have heard, you've got notes that are due each week as we're moving forward, chapter 39, chapter 40, chapter 41. So be carving out time to do chunks of your notes. But then also when it comes to your writing, come prepared tomorrow with any questions you guys might have as far as how your writing should be done. And if I can help you out in any way, please let me know. Also, if you've asked a conference with me, I'll be getting back to you later on today. I just want to finish up with all the other essays that are remaining for period 4. And then I'll start getting back to you if you asked for a personal conference. Let me see. Can you check my email from a while ago, or should I send another? I'll be Maylee. I'm going to be going through all of my emails today. They've kind of piled up as I've been trying to plow through DBQs. But I'll be going through and responding during the course of the day as well. So if you want to send another one, just to make sure you can. But if you know you've got something sitting there, I should be getting back to you later on today. Good luck, you guys. I miss you guys. I hope to see you soon. But we'll definitely meet tomorrow at 8 a.m.